August 16th, 1977, 3:30 a.m., Graceland, Memphis, Tennessee. The silence was an affront, not the silence of peace, but the heavy, suffocating silence that only extreme solitude can create, a cruel contrast to the screams of hysteria that had accompanied him for 2 decades. The air conditioning hummed but did not break the tension. At the top of the marble staircase, inside a room that was a sanctuary of velvet and fear, stood Elvis Presley. He was no longer the king, the volcanic force that stopped the world. He was a large man, bloated by exhaustion and chemical palliatives, fighting a silent war against his own body. His eyes, once full of fire, now reflected only exhaustion. He was in a final dilemma: yield to the pain consuming him or gather the last ounce of dignity to face the night. He tried to rise from the sofa, a monumental effort. His body, once an instrument of dance and seduction, was now a heavy, aching armor. His fiancée, Ginger Alden, was in bed, a short distance away but light years from his pain. He needed a refuge, a place where the legend could not reach him. The book he held, The Scientific Search for the Face of Jesus, was a silent testament to his desperate search for cosmic answers to earthly problems. He staggered. Ginger, sleepy, murmured in the dark, a distant, almost irrelevant voice. "Don't fall asleep out there." Elvis paused. He leaned on the doorframe. The end was here. He looked into nothingness. There was no stage, no audience, just the darkness of Graceland devouring him. His voice, once the most potent on the planet, was reduced to a thread, a haunted whisper, but one that carried the weight of his entire life and his last act of will. He replied, "I'm going to the bathroom to read." The phrase, the banality of a giant, a man who owned castles and lost the ground beneath his feet. He climbed the stairs, one last effort. And then the crushing silence. What drove him to this point of final solitude? And why did such an ordinary whisper become the saddest epilogue in rock history?
We look at the photos and see the icon in glittering jumpsuits, the show. But this is not a story about the rock and roll myth. It is a story about the price of fame, about the emptiness that sets in when you reach the top and have nowhere else to go. It is the tragedy of Aaron Presley, the boy who bought the house for his mother and became a prisoner in it. The humanity behind the legend is what moves us, the struggle against the shadows that we all face on a much, much larger scale. If you have ever felt crushed by expectations, if you have ever searched for the light in the middle of the darkness, this journey is vital. We are going to go down the staircase of Graceland, not to judge, but to understand the pain that only lost love can cause. This story needs to be heard from the beginning. So take a deep breath, relax, subscribe to the channel now and hit the bell, because the fall of Elvis is a mirror for our own fragility, and that truth cannot be forgotten. We return to 1935, Tupelo, Mississippi. The dirt floor, the poverty, the birth with his twin brother Jesse Garin, who died hours later, the mark of loss. Elvis grew up with the ghost of his brother, under the oppressive and possessive love of his mother, Gladys. Gladys was his universe, his safe harbor, his terror. He had a deep fear of the dark and of solitude, directly linked to that initial loss. His dream was not fame, it was security for Gladys. The first guitar, a birthday gift, was not an instrument of art, but a weapon against poverty. Every chord was a promise. "I'm going to get you out of here, Mama." He absorbed the musical mix of the South, the country of the whites, the blues and gospel of the blacks, creating the alchemy that would change the world. The shyness was crushing, but music was the only place where he was brave. In 1954, The Thunder, Sun Records, the voice that broke racial and cultural barriers. the hip swivel that drove the world mad. The ascent was dizzying, but the foundation was fragile. Fame came like a tsunami, and he embraced it as a substitute for the love he desperately sought. But the tragedy came in 1958, the death of Gladys. She was crushed by his success, by the distance, by the fear of losing him to the world. Her death was the incurable wound. Elvis, the king, became an emotional orphan. He cried uncontrollably at the funeral, screaming that his life was over. And in many ways, it was. Graceland, the mansion he had bought for her, became a mausoleum of luxury. He was trying to fill the void left by Gladys with the clamor of millions, with gifts, with food, with medications. The search for a maternal substitute in every woman, the desperate need to be adored. Everything was a scream for his mother. He gave his soul to the stage, but lost his heart in the process.
The 70s, the Las Vegas stage, cement, air conditioning, and the insane routine imposed by Colonel Tom Parker, the exploitative and controlling figure who acted as his owner. There were 156 shows a year, an exhausting treadmill. Elvis was trapped. The rock star fantasy was now a straitjacket. His body began to fail, glaucoma, high blood pressure, paralyzed bowels. He was in constant pain, a pain that doctors, at Parker's request, anesthetized with mountains of medication. Amphetamines to go up, sedatives to come down. The vicious cycle. The white jumpsuit, once a symbol of power, was a cruel joke, tight on a body that no longer belonged to him. The Memphis Mafia, the entourage of friends and relatives he supported, was more of a golden cage than a support system. They loved him, but they isolated him. The dependency was total. The marriage to Priscilla, over. He drowned in paranoia, reading about esotericism and seeking contact with aliens, anything to get him out of that suffocating reality. The fall reached its peak in 1977 with the publication of the book, Elvis, What Happened?, written by his former bodyguards. The world saw the pathetic, out-of-control, addicted king. He was publicly humiliated. The shame was the last straw. He was at rock bottom, a stranger in his own home, a puppet in his own show. The last concert in Indianapolis, June '77, was a tragedy. He could barely stand, singing the wrong lyrics, the voice hoarse, the body swollen. He knew. He said goodbye to the stage with a performance that was not a show, but an anticipated funeral. Solitude was his only faithful audience. Everything was lost.
But even in the hell of Graceland, there was a light, an anchoring point that kept him connected to reality. A figure who saw him not as the king, but as Daddy, Lisa Marie. His daughter. Lisa Marie, at 9 years old, was his moral compass, the only unconditional love left after Gladys's death. She refused to treat him like the idol. To her, he was just the man who spoiled her, who took her to play in the garden, who made her feel safe. In the days leading up to his death, amidst the fog of medication, Elvis had a moment of epiphany, a rare state of clarity. He was lying on the sofa, almost inert. Lisa Marie walked into the room. She didn't ask for anything. She just nestled next to him. That touch, that silent innocence, was his angel. The confrontation with that purity was what he needed. He hugged her. The hug was not for comfort, it was a promise. He promised himself in a last gasp of his conscience that he would try to change, that he would fight the drugs, that he would get rehabilitated. The promise was for her. His life was destroyed, but hers would not be. Lisa Marie's presence, her turning point, was Aaron Presley's last act of love, the desperate attempt to save what was left of his soul.
On the final night, calm hung over Graceland, a sinister calm. Elvis, strangely reflective, spent time gathering the members of his court, not to give orders, but to say goodbye. He handed out presents. Small gestures, but full of meaning. They were not the grand, impulsive gifts of before, but objects that seemed to carry a weight of finality. He stopped in front of his cousin and confidant, Billy Smith. He didn't say grandiose words. He just hugged him, a strong, desperate hug that surprised Billy. That hug was not from a boss, but from a brother saying goodbye. And then, the final whisper of kindness to someone who loved him unconditionally. "I love you, Billy. You've been a good friend." It was his final act of kindness, a revelation of his shattered humanity. It was the man, Aaron, reconciling with the people who mattered most, silently asking for forgiveness for having lost himself. It was proof that the soul of the boy from Tupelo was still there, desperately seeking human warmth before the final coldness. Simple gratitude. Non-mythological love. Acceptance. He was preparing for departure, leaving behind a trail of simple affection.
The king's body was found hours later, fallen on the bathroom floor. The world stopped. The myth of immortality was shattered. 10 years later, Graceland, once Elvis's solitary prison, transformed into a sanctuary, the second most visited home in America. Elvis's legacy, which seems stained by the fall, was restored by the strength of his music and the persistence of his fans. Elvis's obsession with protecting Lisa Marie was his final victory. She inherited the property, ensuring that the Presley name continued to resonate with dignity. Those last words, "I'm going to the bathroom to read," became more than a whisper. They are the metaphor for his life. The book was his cover, his refuge to isolate himself from the world. He was seeking solitude in the most mundane act, trying to find the peace that no longer existed in his heart. He died alone, as he always feared, at the height of his power and his pain. But the final resolution is that the man who lost everything found immortality through the giving of his art. The tragedy of his personal life turned into a universal lesson. The search for love and inner peace is the hardest journey, and all the money and fame in the world cannot buy them.
The great myth of Elvis is not how much he sang, but how much he gave of his own life in exchange for his art. The story of Elvis Presley is a parable about the echo of absence. He filled the world with his voice, but died in quietness. He was loved by everyone, but felt alone. He had the power of a king, but sought the peace of a servant. His death was not an ending, but a warning. It whispers, "Do not lose yourself in the sound of your own legend. Do not trade inner peace for applause. Do not let success become your prison." The lesson that remains is about simple kindness. In his final moments, he did not care about the gold records, but about the hug of a friend. He sought the innocence of his daughter. May his story teach us to value the small things, the embrace, the silence that is not emptiness, the light that comes from within. May his voice, which still reverberates, be a reminder: fame is fleeting, but love is the only legacy that withstands time. And that is why. Because some stories must not be forgotten. The innocence of Tupelo, the smell of dust and cotton that permeated the air, was the setting where Aaron's soul was forged, but also scarred. That two-room shack was a womb of affection and fear. Vernon, his father, was always on the edge of the law, always on the brink of bankruptcy. Vernon's imprisonment for forgery, an event that profoundly traumatized him, reinforced in Elvis and Gladys the idea that the world outside was an enemy. The only salvation was his mother's tight embrace. Gladys's love was not just maternal love, it was an obsession, a fusion. She called him my baby, even when he was a grown man. The ghost of Jesse Garon hung over them, making Elvis, the survivor, doubly precious and doubly feared to be lost. His passion for gospel music was not entertainment. It was a search for solace. The nights at the East Tupelo First Assembly of God were his escape, the rhythm and harmony that gave him a sense of belonging and power that the outside world denied him. At 19, in 1954, when Sam Phillips at Sun Records asked, "Who do you sound like?" Elvis replied, "I don't sound like nobody." That sentence was a manifesto and a curse. He was desperate to be unique, desperate to be noticed, desperate to earn money for Gladys. The recording of That's All Right, Mama was not a musical accident. It was the explosion of a volcano of social and racial repression. The world was about to change, and the shy boy with long sideburns was the trigger. But every step toward fame was a step away from Gladys. The first gold record, the first chaotic show, the first contract. She was proud, yes, but with every show, she felt her son slipping through her fingers. The move to the mansion in Memphis, Graceland, in 1957, was a milestone, but a cruel irony. He bought material security, but began the emotional fall. The house was big, but Gladys's heart was shrinking, suffocated by the opulence and the distance that success imposed. She felt out of place, ignored.
And then the fatal blow. August 14th, 1958. Gladys died of heart failure. Elvis was in the Army, serving in Germany, an obligation that Colonel Parker orchestrated to clean up his two sexual clients' image. He was released for the funeral. The despair that followed was not staged. It was the pain of a son who had lost his universe. He screamed, throwing himself onto the coffin, pleading for her to come back. That day, the king died, and the myth began to feed on his emotional corpse. He was never the same. His life after Gladys became an incessant, futile search for substitutes, women who could care for him as she did, fans who could fill the void with adoration. Fame transformed from a dream into a prison. Graceland, the house he bought for love, became his labyrinth, his cloister. The journey to Germany, however, brought him a new figure, Priscilla Beaulieu, a 14-year-old girl whom he could mold and control, who promised the fidelity and comfort that Gladys had taken with her. The subsequent marriage was less an act of romantic love and more a desperate attempt to recreate the lost family structure. But the king could not have a normal life. He isolated her in Graceland. She was a living doll, a queen trapped in a castle that, in fact, was a tomb. He was not a husband. He was an idol who needed to be served. Infidelity and emotional distance were inevitable. The only true thing born of that marriage was Lisa Marie, the ray of sunshine, who would become his final anchor. The 60s, the Hollywood desert. Colonel Parker, his manipulative manager with a mysterious past, many believed he was an undocumented illegal immigrant, kept Elvis away from the stage and imprisoned him in a series of silly, repetitive films. He filmed 27 feature films in 8 years, most of poor quality, where he was the singer in exotic settings. Elvis hated it. He felt wasted, humiliated. His art withered. The frustration, the anger, the impotence, all of it was repressed and built the time bomb that would explode in the next decade.
The only light, the only moment of artistic rescue was the '68 comeback special. The black leather jacket, the guitar, the small, intimate stage. There, for a brief moment, the hungry rocker from Tupelo returned. It was a spectacular rebirth, a promise, but the promise did not last. The return to Vegas, the golden prison. Colonel Parker orchestrated the triumphant return to Las Vegas, but it was a trap. Gigantic contracts at the International Hotel, the confinement, the routine, the pressure of being the world's greatest entertainer every night. Elvis began to wear the uniform, the white jumpsuit. It was armor, but also a shroud. The sequins hid the man who was disintegrating inside. The audience screamed, "Long live the king!" But the man was dying of exhaustion. He demanded that his suite always be cold, dark, and stocked with anything he ordered. The bedroom became a bunker, a refuge from reality. The paranoia grew, fueled by the Memphis Mafia and the excess medication. The list of medications was a pharmacy. Stimulants in the morning to wake up, sedatives during the day to calm down, more sedatives at night to sleep. He walked around with a briefcase full of pills. His doctors, who received incredibly expensive gifts from Elvis, prescribed everything he wanted. They were less doctors and more accomplices. His body was at war. Glaucoma left him almost blind on stage. The swelling was constant. The chronic pain in his back and head was unbearable. He became temperamental, violent, and deeply melancholic. The separation from Priscilla in 1972, followed by the final divorce, destroyed him. He lost the last person who tried to save him from Parker and from himself. He sank into an endless cycle of new, empty relationships and excessive consumption of food and medication. He watched movies and read religious and spiritual books all day, searching for meaning in his misery, trying to find a salvation that people and stages could not give him.
The 1977 tour was a nightmare. The reports were horrifying. Elvis could barely remember the lyrics. He was obese, dragging himself across the stage, his voice weak and hoarse. The media jokes were cruel. The king was dismantling himself in public. The final betrayal? The book Elvis, What Happened, where his own bodyguards revealed the horror of his private life, broke what was left of his dignity. He felt exposed, betrayed, humiliated before the world he had conquered. He became a paranoid recluse in Graceland, the darkness closing in on him. He was afraid. Afraid of everything, of losing his daughter, of Parker, of the audience, of death itself. That man, who had conquered the world, was curled up in fear on his own throne. The last show in Indianapolis, the agonizing performance. He knew it was the end. And then, the return to Graceland, the countdown to that fateful August day. Amidst the chaos of his physical and emotional decay, there was a silence in Graceland, a small refuge of truth that materialized in the figure of Lisa Marie. She, at 9 years old, was the only human being who did not treat him as a god or as a money-making machine. To her, he was just Daddy. An imposing figure, yes, but still, just her father. Her presence was the anchor of salvation, the only link to reality that still mattered to his heart. Priscilla, his ex-wife, despite the separation, kept their daughter close, hoping that this bond could, somehow, rescue the man behind the myth. Lisa Marie did not judge the mountain of medication, the nocturnal habits, or the fits of paranoia. She just wanted her father's attention. She symbolically became his angel. She was the living incarnation of the unconditional love he had lost with Gladys, but without the suffocation of dependency.
In the final days of his life, in the oppressive atmosphere of Graceland, these encounters were increasingly precious. He could spend hours in the darkroom, but upon hearing Lisa Marie's voice, something broke the veil of his lethargy. One day, shortly before that fateful August, he was particularly unwell, almost catatonic on the living room sofa. The Memphis Mafia walked in circles, not knowing what to do. Lisa Marie walked in. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply approached, climbed onto the sofa, and nestled next to him, placing her head on his shoulder. In that silence, the child confronted the monster. Lisa Marie's touch was the turning point. He felt the warmth, the innocence, the silent demand to be present. In that moment, the fog dissipated.
He hugged her with a force that almost startled him. It was a hug of rediscovery. He realized that the true inheritance he needed to leave was not money or music, but the man behind everything. The silent promise made to himself as he smelled his daughter's hair was that he would fight. He would get rehabilitated. He would do it for Lisa Marie. Her love was his last chance for redemption, the final desperate attempt to reverse the trajectory of the fall. Life for him now had only one purpose: to be the father she deserved before it was too late. On that last night, the early morning of August 16th, he was strangely agitated and reflective. The promise made to Lisa Marie hung over him, guilt and the desire for change battling against the crushing weight of years of chemical abuse. He wandered through Graceland, touching objects, reading. His final gesture was not a spectacle, but an act of silent kindness and despair. He gathered some of the members of his inner circle who were awake. They were the ones who endured the worst of his temper and his addictions. He did not give them a sermon, he gave them gratitude. He began to hand out personal gifts, items with meaning, small gestures of affection. It was an act of settling accounts with the world, a way of trying to alleviate the weight of his own conscience. The most touching moment, the true revelation of his humanity, occurred with his cousin Billy Smith and Billy's wife Jo. They were, arguably, the closest to him, living on the property and enduring the vicious cycle of his life. He sat with them for a long time. They were just three people in the darkness, stripped of legends and glamour. He talked about the future, about plans he already knew he would not see. And as he said goodbye, he was not the king, he was Aaron. The hug he gave Billy Smith was long, unusual, a hug of unsaid farewell. For Billy, for everyone who understood him, that was the moment of true goodbye. A goodbye without words, without spectacle, but with a lot of understanding.
He whispered to Billy, not with the voice of command, but with the voice of fear and friendship. I love you, Billy. You've been a good friend. No matter what happens, take care of Lisa Marie. The phrase carried the weight of his life and his imminent death. It was not about him. It was about his daughter's future. He was passing the baton of unconditional love, the only thing he truly possessed. That gesture, the transfer of moral responsibility for Lisa Marie, was his final confession that he was at the limit and his greatest demonstration of paternal love. He retreated. The last kiss for Ginger, his fiancée, and then the whisper of those final, banal, and terrifying words, "I'm going to the bathroom to read." The last act of a man trying to isolate himself to face, alone, his destiny. The news of the collapse in the Graceland bathroom at 4 a.m. and the declaration of his death at 3:30 p.m. on August 16, 1977, stopped the world. The headlines were titanic, the hysteria global. But the true resolution of Elvis's story is not in the tragedy of death, but in the strength of the legacy that emerged from the grief. 10 years later, the doors of Graceland, which had once been the barrier that isolated the king, opened to the world. Colonel Parker, who controlled Elvis until death, lost control of the property. Priscilla Presley, with a clear vision and love for her ex-husband's legacy, transformed the solitary mausoleum into a vibrant sanctuary. The house that Elvis bought for his mother and where he found solitude became a place of pilgrimage, generating millions and preserving the memory. This was the first major post-death turning point, the conversion of a private tragedy into a public memorial. The house that imprisoned him now freed him to immortality. The other great resolution is Lisa Marie. She became the heir, the guardian of her father's legacy. Elvis's love and concern to ensure her security, expressed in that final whisper to Billy Smith, were not in vain. She ensured that her father's image was treated with dignity, investing in the property, honoring the man behind the myth.
Her life, although marked by her father's shadow, was a testament that Elvis's last promise was fulfilled. Elvis's death, a personal disaster, became a cultural catalyst, ensuring that his music continued to resonate, influencing generations. The tragedy of his fall became a lesson about the dangers of adulation and isolation.
The man who died alone in the bathroom, ironic and pathetic to some, became the most human and understandable figure to others. He taught us that having everything is not the same as having peace. He showed us that our greatest struggle is always against our own shadows, and that the purest love, the love of a child, is the only thing that can anchor us, even in our darkest moments. That final whisper, "I'm going to the bathroom to read," was not the phrase of an idol, but the code of a prisoner seeking one last moment of isolation before the final judgment. And his final legacy is not just the music, but the silent cry of a man who only wanted to return to Tupelo, to his mother's arms, before the world consumed him. The great enigma of Graceland does not lie in the expensive cars or the sequined jumpsuits. It lies in the absolute contradiction. The man who possessed the Midas touch and the voice of heaven died with a heart broken by fear and solitude. The story of Elvis Presley is, in its essence, the modern parable of King Midas. Everything he touched turned to gold, into resounding success, but the gold could not hug him, could not console him, could not fill the hole left by the loss of Gladys. Fame, which he sought so much as a salvation from poverty, became his most ingenious and luxurious prison. He taught us involuntarily that external success, when not aligned with internal peace, becomes an empty echo chamber. The sound of applause, which should have been his glory, turned into the white noise that muffled his own inner voice. He was the greatest giver of energy on stage, but an incapable receiver of love backstage.
Elvis's solitude is the solitude of the top, a solitude that is not measured by the absence of people, but by the inability to truly connect. He was surrounded by a court, the Memphis Mafia, but none of them were equals, confidants without an agenda. They were servants, paid friends, an extension of his will, and this isolated him insidiously. He was the focal point of millions, but a stranger to himself. The frantic search for answers in spirituality, the insatiable consumption of books about the afterlife and Eastern religions, was the desperation of a soul that needed a map to get out of the darkness, but was lost in its own palace. That last book, the biography of Jesus in his hands, was not a casual reading object. It was a symbol of his final search for a salvation that money could not buy, a search for a purpose that show business had stolen. His legacy, therefore, is twofold. There is the myth, the music, the cultural revolution he ignited, and which will burn eternally. But there is, above all, the human warning. Elvis's life is a poetic mirror for our own condition. How many times do we trade our authentic self for the performance the world demands? How many times do we smile on the stage of our lives while our heart cries backstage? Elvis's fall reminds us that there are no shortcuts to inner healing. You cannot fill the emptiness of the soul with more things, more fame, more applause. It takes courage to return to silence, to confront the wounds of the past, and to accept the love that is offered simply like that of a daughter. That final whisper, "I'm going to the bathroom to read," is the most melancholy and honest phrase of his life. It was not to read, it was to escape. It was the code for his refuge, a small room where, ironically, the king could finally be alone, unprotected from the world, but mortally vulnerable to himself. He taught us that at the end of life, what remains are not the chords we played, but the bonds we kept, the kindness we expressed, and the courage to be simply human. His voice, eternal and unmistakable, now carries, beyond the joy and the rebellion, a deep melancholy. the melancholy of a man who had everything except peace. May his story serve as our compass. May it inspire us to seek internal truth and not get lost in the superficial shine of the world. May his struggle, his failure, and his broken humanity be our greatest reminder. Value what is real before the darkness closes the curtain, because some stories must not be forgotten.